Afternoon. Welcome to the next edition of Sovereign Thoughts. I appreciate all of you listening and joining in. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about something, as my commitment earlier was to build in public and show folks as we make our kind of decisions, what we're doing and why we're doing it. And something I've been thinking about a lot lately is this concept around organizational context and moving beyond just generic questions and answers. And to put this in kind of, I guess, a little bit of context of why this came up is when I first started building Sovrain and kind of the components that now have become one platform, one integrated platform. I looked at it as kind of consultant, right? Saying, well, if you drop me into any particular area, I should have enough ability to ask the right questions, to drive out the right answers, and to get to where I want to go. Right. And at the end, I always knew that after the collection, my goal was always to have collection be more automated because that was what took a lot of consulting time, but really added very little value and really put the consulting, the knowledge, the skills, the experience that was built over years, put that after the collection, right? So basically, identifying what follow-ups needed to happen, where the gaps were, looking at the responses, and making sure that everything kind of worked. Because behind the scenes, you know, the people that go through the discovery process, what they see is an interview. But really, behind the scenes, there's over 30 agents that combine that information a lot of different ways to create different artifacts or to load, as we'll talk about today, different parts of the platform. And so I always thought that if I could get quality interviews out, that the consultant then would handle the rest. And I wasn't far into the build process when I was asked a very interesting question, which how does it know me? How does it know the organization that I work for? And initially I said, well, like a good consultant, it knows the questions it needs to ask and it drives into each one of them to get that context. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, it just doesn't seem missing something here. And so I went back and I looked at how I had done it. At first I was focused on span of responsibility. I segregated all of the interviews by the level or the scope of responsibility in the organization. And I built it so that as subsequent interviews were carried on, that earlier gaps or follow-ups, that it would build those into the next interviews if they were in the same area or the same roles. But then that question raised a very different question, which was, you're right, how does it know my organization? Because an organization that, let's say, a small bank or credit union that has what $5 million in revenue or $10 million in revenue a year or 20 even. How does that compare to an organization as a billion? They're very different organizations around the way you would handle those interviews. And so that question prompted me to go back and think about how do we give the interviews, because that's really the interjection into the whole process. How do we give them the organizational context that they need? And that's what I want to show you today is how we did that. Hopefully, if nothing else, it gives you a little bit of an idea. If you're building something, it'll give you an idea of how we're handling it. And if you're looking at, well, I really like to learn about my organization. One of the things that the reason that we started with that discovery process was because not everything, even though we hear about AI a lot today, not everything is built on AI, right? We still have messy processes that we still need to clean up. We still have undocumented processes that live in people's head. We have acquisitions where we have to integrate two organizations that are very different. And so I wanted it to be fairly wide capability. But at the same time, I realized that, we do need context. And so what I did in this process was we added what we called an OCM, or an organizational context layer. And the interview uses this as part of its basis. So it understands, I just put Neural Nomad, which is our consulting arm, in here. And I said, we work with banks, credit unions, and fintech, and we're privately held with 1 to 50 employees and a revenue base and where we focus, which is the US, and kind of a little bit about the company. We build, enterprise intelligence systems for financial services to make better decisions, execute strategy. And why that's important is now, as it's going through the interview, it actually knows how to gear those interviews. And one of the things I want to show you too is that you can go beyond the basic setup in here and we can add context. So I can say discovery objectives. Maybe I want to learn about how um, what processes are done manually today that isn't documented, and kind of give it a value. I can add a whole bunch of different context here. Any known systems that we have, departments, hypothesis. My hypothesis is that there is opportunity efficiency in here. I can give it the business context. I can give it organizational context. So all of that gets built in as part of this interviewing process and is actually used throughout the platform as different modules, let's call them, are used. And you can see that, we do have different ones. We have the knowledge-based Cogniz, which I've showed on an earlier live stream. And then we have Orion, which is the, for lack of a better twin, it's both the member twin and the enterprise twin. But basically, what that does is it gives you kind of next best actions. So, for an enterprise, and I can show you this. I think I showed it a couple sessions ago, but that's really the interesting part. And you say, well, Darren, how do you know this works? And since I always admit my screw ups, I'm going to tell you one here. Is that a company had asked us if we could do an AI capability assessment with this. And I said yes, because the interviewer, it was process oriented at the time, but using that same capability with some minor adjustments, we could definitely do an AI capability assessment. And so I built it and I jumped into one of our test tenants and said, oh, let's just grab this one and start the interview process. And one of the first questions the interview asked me is just to describe what I do day to day. What is my organizational role? And so I said, not thinking, coming out of banking, I said, oh, well, I'm a loan processor and mortgage, and this is what I do. And I started typing away and I hit enter, and it came back and it said, I think you may be in the wrong interview. I'm an expert in, I'm an expert in manufacturing. And I stopped and I thought, wait, manufacturing? I didn't build it to ask about manufacturing. At least this interviewer that I was building for AI capability, definitely did not build for just manufacturing. And I thought, well, where did it get that from? And I sat there and I thought about it, and all of a sudden it dawned on me. We had been playing with the context for these companies, and one of them we were showing somebody was how it works for manufacturing and how it would switch from financial services to manufacturing. And of course, I picked the one that was not financial services, and it stopped me. And it said, do you want to continue? Of course not. I don't want to continue. I've been the wrong one. So, I guess that was a good testament that it knew that I was in the wrong spot, and it stopped me from continuing because its context of what the company was and what I was telling it I was doing was completely different. It was not even nearly related. So it stopped me, which I'm glad it did. But, I think that this, the organizational context, not just is the screen that you're looking at, right? It actually is everything that not only is derived from these interviews, because in the interviews we'll look at, how are the processes done, what systems are used, where are the gaps at, where people still have knowledge, what roles do we have, what roles are missing, what are our recommendations, a typical kind of, I guess, we used to call them BPR engagements, now maybe we'll call them AGR, which is agentic business reengineering. But this is why the companies that are building AI today are looking at forward deployed engineers, because you have to understand the business that you're going in. Just adopting generic AI is only going to get you so far. And one of the things that we take this beyond kind of the screen I'm showing from the interview concept, where I'm giving it kind of the context of the organization and what my objectives for the interviews are, is that's just one stage of having context, right? Knowledge. So how do you build this living enterprise? How do you continue to update, the knowledge that it has in here? And that's part of adding context as well, right? So if somebody leaves, the knowledge that they have shouldn't walk out the door. Or if somebody new comes in, why did we make these decisions? If I'm a technology executive, which I've been in the past, why did we decide to go this direction versus that? What was our build versus buy analysis? Maybe it's in a document somewhere, but if it's in my knowledge, I can type right into it and say, oh, why did we make this decision? What is the background on it? What documents support it? And that's part of the context as well. If I build agents and I put them in, they're going to need that kind of information in order to make decisions about, whether it's from defining strategy, top strategy opportunities, or looking at a process and saying, where are opportunities to replace it? Agents, the one thing about agents when you put them in is they're very good at what you put them in too. But when you insert them into an organization that has been designed for them, they have an opportunity to, you know, expand rapidly to their capability, which puts stress on both sides of the process, which I know I've talked about that in the past. And that's no different than when we ever introduced technology, right? I mean, if you could underwrite faster, it put more stress on the closers, it put more stress on the originators, right? Because I can push process through faster. And the question is, how do I fill that funnel? I talked a lot about kind of looking at looking at those carts with loans that we used to process mortgages, and having carts, paper on carts as far as the eye could see. And all of a sudden, we introduced digital imaging and document capture and processing, electronic document processing, and all of a sudden the carts were gone. Well, what do we do, right? And planning for those kinds of things. And I think that's why you see so many kind of organizations where they talk about they struggle from pilot to actual implementation. But that's a side conversation. Sometimes I happen to I go in them directions if you know me. But one of the things that I think is so important is this organizational concept, context concept, and I wanted to show you kind of what we've done and what we're building towards. And if you have other ideas, I'd love to hear them. If you're doing it a different way, how are you doing it? And if you're interested in kind of figuring out what what this does or how it works or any other item, as I mentioned, we did build an AI capability assessment as well, just to see where the organization is, and that's being tested right now by a couple different organizations that wanted to try it and use it. So um, anyway, I'm not going to ramble on. It looks like I've taken about 15 minutes or so today, so I hope you appreciate and understand kind of how we've approached context in our process. And if you have other ideas, love to hear them. Appreciate your time today. Thank you.